show The True Entity of Life recently. I wonder if you'd be kind enough to explain to me a paragraph I've always found rather difficult to understand. It's in Volume 1 of the Gosho, on page 91, and reads, "Although not worthy of the honor, Nichiren was nevertheless the first to spread the mystic law entrusted to Bodhisattva Jojo for propagation in the latter day of the law. Nichiren was also the first to inscribe the Gohonzon, which is the embodiment of the Buddha from the remote past, as revealed in the Juryo chapter of the essential teaching of Tahoe Buddha, who appeared when the Hoto chapter of the theoretical teaching was preached, and the Bodhisattvas of the earth who emerged with the Jujutsu chapter. No matter how people may hate Nichiren, they cannot possibly alter the fact of his enlightenment."
Well, this is, so far as this Gosho, the true entity of life, is concerned, this is really the beginning of his revelation section. As you know, all Gosho begin with a section which is preparation, and then move into the most important part, which is the revelation. And then following the revelation is transmission, which is also extremely important because it is really guidance on the transmission of the teachings to future generations.
I see.
So, so far as this particular passage is concerned, it's a useful one because it therefore provides one with the necessary basis on which to understand everything else that is said. So in making this paragraph here, or writing it, he is really also showing the clear and orthodox flow of his own teachings from the teachings of Shakyamuni 2,000 years before Nichiren Daishonin was born. So in this case, he says, although not worthy of the honor, Nichiren was nevertheless the first to spread the mystic law entrusted to Bodhisattva Jojo for propagation in the latter day of the law. So Bodhisattva Jojo, as I'm sure you know, was the leader of the Bodhisattvas of the earth, who appeared in the ceremony of the air and the treasure tower. And he was accompanied by 3 other leaders who we don't need to worry about for the moment. But there were a total of 4 leaders of the Bodhisattvas of the earth. And in fact, Nichiren Daishonin, as the votary of the Lotus Sutra, which he announced that he was when he first began to teach, was inferring to the fact that as the votary of the Lotus Sutra, he was fulfilling the role of Bodhisattva Jojo.
Right.
All right?
Yeah.
Who had appeared in the Lotus Sutra. In other words, what Shakyamuni was conveying in those chapters of the Lotus Sutra were his predictions of the way in which Buddhism would spread in the future.
Right.
So he predicted at that time that 2,000 years after his death, which would be the beginning of the latter day of the law, a great votary would appear in a country, he stated, which was to the northeast of Japan, to the northeast of India, and this person would spread the teachings for that age. And in another part of the Lotus Sutra, he also explained that that age, which we call Mappo, which is the age we live in now, the first part of the latter day of the law, would be a period of great chaos and suffering in the world, and that the 3 poisons of greed and anger and ignorance would be rife everywhere. And however, in the midst of this very dreadful period, he called it in one place the dreaded age of Mappo, the votary of the Lotus Sutra, Bodhisattva Jojo, would appear and teach what he termed the great pure law. He'd already said that his own pure law would by then have become ineffective for the people of that age, but that a great pure law, which would help everyone, every human being, to overcome their sufferings, would appear out of the chaos of that dreaded age of Mappo, and that it would be the great teaching of the world for 10,000 years and on into eternity. So here he is saying that he really is fulfilling the role of Bodhisattva Jojo, and he points out that he is the first person in the history of this planet to inscribe the Gohonzon, which is the embodiment of the Buddha for the remotest past. That is to say, of course, hidden behind that, as he was later to reveal, it was himself, the original Buddha. And then he says Tahoe Buddha, who appeared when the Hoto chapter of the theoretical teaching was preached, and the Bodhisattvas of the earth, who emerged with the Yujutsu chapter. So Tahoe Buddha is, if you remember, the legendary Buddha who sat next to Shakyamuni Buddha in that great treasure tower, which was representing life itself. And you remember also that after Tahoe Buddha had invited Shakyamuni to come and sit next to him in this great treasure tower, they then turned to each other and nodded in agreement. So they were nodding in agreement to the great pure law, which we know from Nichiren Daishonin's teachings was Nam-myoho Renge Kyo. And if you remember also, a banner with Myoho Renge Kyo on it was hoisted above their heads. So the nodding to each other was representing the relationship of ourselves with the Buddha or the Gohonzon which embodies the life of the Buddha. So this is expressed by a principle called Kochi Yogo. Kochi Yogo. So Kyo is your objective, or the objective reality of your environment and everything in it, represented by Tahoe Buddha, also represented at the great and good fortune which you can draw from your environment to yourself. Chi of Kyochi is oneself or yourself with the wisdom of the Buddha, right? Through the chanting, of course, of Nam-myoho Renge Kyo. And Myogo means fused together. So in other words, with the wisdom of the Buddha, which comes to you from chanting Nam-myoho Renge Kyo, you connect with the Buddha on the Gohonzon, or embodied in the Gohonzon. But also, of course, you are connecting with the Buddha in everything and everyone that exists surrounding you in your environment. So, therefore, through that fusion, you can draw, through the wisdom of chanting Nam-myoho Renge Kyo, great good fortune in all and many and different forms from everything that surrounds you. Okay so far?
That's wonderful.
So, I better go on a little more. He then says, no matter how people may hate Nichiren, they cannot possibly alter the fact of his enlightenment. So there can be no doubt whatsoever that Nichiren Daishonin was self-enlightened. No master taught him the great law of Nam-myoho Renge Kyo. No master taught him of the necessity for the Gohonzon in order to transmit his teachings to the future. So he was self-enlightened to that. And we learn from elsewhere in the Kosho that Nichiren Daishonin only appears once in this or any other world of all the boundless worlds that may have something equivalent to human beings in the whole universe. And his purpose, therefore, is to appear and start everything, begin everything. In other words, to begin to preach an understanding of the existence of the great law of life. This is his mission. So he says here, nobody can alter the fact that that is what I'm teaching. So it might be worth mentioning here the Bodhisattvas of the earth next, but perhaps it's better for you to take a passage a bit further along, which actually mentions the appearance of the Bodhisattvas of the earth.
Yes, I was actually going to do that because I would like you to clarify if that actually refers to us ordinary human beings now. It's the paragraph after the one that I've just quoted, which says, Nichiren alone began to carry out the task of the Bodhisattvas of the earth. He may even be one of them. If Nichiren should be a Bodhisattva of the earth, then so must his disciples. The Hoshi chapter states, if there's someone, whether a man or woman, who secretly teaches to one person even a single phrase of the Lotus Sutra, let it be known that he is the envoy of the Buddha, sent to carry out the Buddha's work. Who else but us can this possibly refer to?
So this is an extraordinarily important paragraph, particularly at these times that we're living in now, and of course with the problem of the priesthood at the head temple. So he is saying very clearly here, isn't he? Who else but us can this possibly refer to? In other words, he and Sarenbo, to whom this letter or treatise was written, must be Bodhisattvas of the earth, because they are fulfilling the predictions of the Lotus Sutra. So the Bodhisattvas of the earth were the people who appeared in countless numbers out of the earth, as it were, from nowhere almost, in the story of the treasure tower and the ceremony in the air. So in that story, to continue from where I left off last time, after the two Buddhas have nodded together and agreed about the transmission of the great law in the future, and the Myoho Renge Kyo banner has been raised above their heads, Shakyamuni then looks at all his assembled disciples who are surrounding this great treasure tower in which they're sitting. And he says to them, who is going to propagate the great law in the dreaded age of Mappo, or words to that effect, of the latter day of the early days of the latter day of the law? And of course, all his disciples, yes, me, put their hands up eagerly to be able to undertake this great mission. But he actually had to say to them, I'm really sorry, or words to that effect, but none of you have the necessary qualities to do that. And as he said that, these people began to appear, ordinary people like you and I, began to appear out of the ground. Thousands of them, tens of thousands of them. In the description, I think it says that as many as the sands of, I think it's 60,000 Ganges rivers. And this enormous multitude. And he points to them and says to his disciples, Shakyamuni's disciples, these are those who will teach the great law in the dreaded age of Mappo, or words to that effect. So, of course, and he said that they would have the qualities to be able to lead people to understand the true teachings in those times. So, the Bodhisattvas of the earth, in other words, viewed from today, is every one of us people who are sincerely chanting Nam-myoho Renge Kyo to the Gohonzon and spreading the teachings wherever we go. So this is an undeniable fact. So even if you look at SGI today, it is the great organization, if you like, of the Bodhisattvas of the earth. All over the world, there are people like you and I who are chanting Nam-myoho Renge Kyo and spreading the teachings wherever we go. So SGI is the organization of the Bodhisattvas of the earth. So going back 40 or 50 years to just after World War II, the high priests that followed the World War, their names were Nissho Shonin and Nichiren Shonin and Nitatsu Shonin. They understood the significance of the appearance of the Soka Gakkai, starting just before World War II, as a little band of about 3,000 by the time the World War actually broke out. And then they stood up under Mr. Makiguchi's leadership and defended the purity of the teachings, which were already in danger of being tainted because of the pressure the government was putting on the head temple in order to get them to absorb or include tenets, teachings of Shinto, especially emperor worship, in the teachings, in the Buddhist teachings, Nichiren Daishonin's teachings. And as you know, he stood up and fought against it. They already had one Shinto shrine in the head temple at that time. But he fought against it and, of course, protected the head temple in that way, and unfortunately was sent to prison by the governing authorities and died there. So at the end of World War II, who stood up but Mr. Toda, coming out of prison, and although he was so sick and weak physically, he determined to continue to cause this great gathering of Bodhisattvas of the earth to grow, knowing and convinced that this was his mission, based on the Lotus Sutra, which he'd read in prison, and realized that he must too be a Bodhisattva of the earth. So when he came out of prison, his determination was to resuscitate the Soka Gakkai and make it grow so greatly that it could never be near to destruction, as it happened during that war. So, as I say, the high priests of those times understood the significance. In other words, that SGI was a mystic organization that had appeared for a purpose, which was to really launch the movement for Kosen Rufu. And even this present high priest, Nichiren, in his New Year message in this very year, said that the SGI was a mystic organization in his message sent to us all, published everywhere in the world in our new first edition of our journals. Of course, we had no idea that at that time he was also plotting to destroy it. It's unbelievable, isn't it? But that's what we know now was happening. So at the same time, he was saying they were a mystic organization. And then just recently, we received the edict to say that the whole of the Soka Gakkai and SGI was excommunicated. So it's very difficult to believe that such things could be done by a person with a sane mind. And of course, one has to bear in mind that the devilish force of life, works in very extraordinary ways, and sometimes very powerfully. So anyway, that was what he said in his New Year message this very year, in January of 1991. So it's extraordinary, but there you are. He has set about to destroy the organization of the Bodhisattvas of the earth, which undeniably we are, because we sincerely practice as Nichiren Daishonin taught.
I'm very glad that you clarified that, because ever since I've started to practice, I've been told that I was a follower of the Bodhisattvas of the earth. And when I read the paragraph I'd now like to refer to, this causes me a great deal of confusion. It's the paragraph which begins, no matter what, maintain your faith as a votary of the Lotus Sutra, and forever exert yourself as Nichiren's disciple. If you're of the same mind as Nichiren, you must be a Bodhisattva of the earth. And since you're a Bodhisattva of the earth, there's not the slightest doubt that you've been a disciple of the Buddha from the remotest past. The Yujitsu chapter states, I have taught these people since the remotest past. There should be no discrimination amongst those who propagate the 5 characters of Myoho Renge-kyo in the latter day of the law, be they men or women. Were they not bodhisattvas of the earth, they could not chant the Daimoku.
Right. So that's very clear, isn't it? Without a shadow of doubt, as I've said, we must be the bodhisattvas of the earth. And it was out of the problems which arose with the priesthood about 10 years ago that this insistence on calling ourselves the followers of the bodhisattvas of the earth was made by the priesthood, by the head temple. And therefore any books that have been published up till now, recent times, have always stated followers of the bodhisattvas of the earth rather than bodhisattvas of the earth. Now, to be frank, I've never got a satisfactory explanation for that. But I'm sure it had a lot to do with the ambitions of certain priests, senior priests at the head temple, who wished already to begin to make it clear that they were in some way superior to the ordinary lay members, and that this was one of the ways they wished to show it. So it's very mysterious to understand, because the priesthood is comparatively small, and I can't imagine if they thought they were the only bodhisattvas of the earth and that everyone else were just followers of the bodhisattvas of the earth, then that would hardly match the description of as many as the sands of 60,000 Ganges rivers. But nevertheless, it seems to me that in some way they wanted to show that the lay people were inferior in some way to themselves. I really don't know any other explanation for that. As I said, though I've asked, I've never got it except to say, oh, we've just got to, for the time being, continue to call ourselves the followers of the Bodhisattvas of the earth. So in this sort of establishment of a form of peace with the priesthood, that 10 years or so ago, this was presumably one of their directions. So it was leading up, of course, to what is happening today, where they've openly started to state that the priesthood is on a different level, a higher level, to the lay people themselves.
That seems to be in direct contradiction of what Nichiren Daishonin says all the way through the Gosho. And here, just a little bit later on, he emphasizes the point that we're all equal when he says, only I, Nichiren, at first chanted Nam-myoho Renge-kyo, but then 2, 3, and 100 followed, chanting and teaching others. Likewise, propagation will unfold this way in the future. Doesn't this signify emerging from the earth? At the time of Kozen Rufu, the entire Japanese nation will chant Nam-myoho Renge-kyo, as surely as an arrow aimed at the earth cannot miss the target.
Wonderful words, aren't they, too? Yes, of course, it is absolutely crystal clear. And not only in this particular Gosho, but in many other places in the Gosho, it's crystal clear that the lay people are absolutely, everyone is equal before the Gohonzon. Absolutely. So one can only assume that this tendency amongst the priests has grown out of the corruption which has manifested itself in the Buddhist priesthood in Japan as a whole. And this means one has to go back into history, and I don't think we've got time to do that today. But the fact is that from the time, particularly of the Tokugawa shoguns, the priesthood were given secular power, secular authority over the lay people as a means of controlling the country with an iron fist, which the shoguns executed. So there's been a very interesting essay which has been written recently by a professor of Meiji University, who is a professor of history and has been for 30 years, and he explains this whole thing. So the priest had extraordinary power. He was really the government agent in his village or town, and as such was expected to report back to the military authorities any strange behavior on the part of any of the members of the community, as well, of course, as acting as a priest and expecting donations for his temple. So one can see how easily a person can be corrupted under such a system. Even the two characters for the word temple, actually, one of the, as you know, characters, they have various translations, but one of the translations is registered office. It's extraordinary, isn't it? So in other words, this was the place where you had to go and to obtain, for instance, a passport to permit you to travel to another city or another town. Nobody could leave the village without that passport. And furthermore, you could not propagate religion, and equally you couldn't leave or give up your allegiance to the temple which you had, your father, your grandfather, and all the rest of it had been supporters of. So it was an extraordinary, an amazingly cunning and skillful way to rule. I suppose one's got to give the Tokugawa shoguns full marks, because in that way they controlled the whole population. And the corruption of the priests really expanded through that period. This was aided, interestingly enough, as this professor teaches, by the fact that Christianity had become an enemy in Japan under the Tokugawa shoguns. Not immediately, but a little later, in the 250 years they ruled, Christians were persecuted very strongly. And so anyone who, for instance, didn't come to the temple on the days they should have come, or who failed to make contributions, or adequate contributions, or behaved strangely in any way, was then branded as a Christian. In other words, secretly, behind the scenes, they were no longer Buddhists, and therefore they were no longer loyal to the temple. And once a person was branded as a Christian, he was struck off from the register of the temple as a believer, and ostracized by society completely. So no one dared speak to the man, because otherwise they would have been branded as a Christian too. And so this ostracization of people who, for one reason or another, resented the priest's power or just didn't feel like giving their all to them in the terms of money, were ostracized and became a sort of lowest caste of Japanese citizen. And interestingly enough, even today, this lowest caste and the descendants of it still exists. So this is a point of some shame, certainly to any Sokogakai member, but also to many people, a growing feeling of shame that such a class should still exist. And various human rights movements are beginning to exert pressure and influence in Japan for this nasty corner of their society to be cleared up. It's so incredible, isn't it? And this was all this through the actions of these priests centuries ago. So anyway, it was rather a long time I spent on that, but it is important to understand that what you're seeing happening in the Nichiren Shoshu priesthood is this whole corruption coming to a head. And this Meiji professor who's written this thesis, which we published in the bulletin actually, in this latest one, he ends by saying that this is not just going to be a revolution, a religious revolution within the precincts of the Nichiren Shoshu head temple, but he believes that it'll bring about a religious revolution in the whole of Japan, because Buddhist priests everywhere in Japan are following a similar corrupt way.
This seems to be, I mean, as a lay believer in Great Britain, I find it very, very remote, but I gather now that the priesthood have actually excommunicated us.
Yes.
And I find that very interesting because excommunicate is a Christian phrase anyway. It means you can't take communion anymore. But we don't do anything like that. And if Nichiren Daishonin teaches that we all have Buddhahood inside us, then how can anybody divorce me from that? And again, in this Gosho, it says, Taho Buddha had offered Shakyamuni Buddha a place beside him when they unfurled the banner of Myoho Renge-kyo. The two leaders of the entire multitude made their decision together. Could there have been anything false in their decision? Their ultimate purpose in meeting was to provide a way for all of us ordinary people to attain Buddhahood.
Exactly. First, I must correct you, though, because excommunication doesn't only mean, if you check in the dictionary, it doesn't only mean that you're unable to take communion in a Christian church or community. It actually means that you no longer have communication with that community. In other words, you're totally expelled from it. You'll find there are two meanings. It can also specifically mean you can't have Holy Communion. But the other meaning is there too. So, of course, this step to excommunicate is quite ridiculous. I went rushing to the encyclopedia, or I asked someone else to rush to the encyclopedia and look up, for instance, what happened when Henry VIII decided to separate this country, or England, from the Roman rule, Catholic rule over us, and in a religious sense. And of course it was only he who was excommunicated. The Pope didn't excommunicate the whole of the English people. No, such a thing is quite ridiculous. So this excommunication thing therefore means nothing, actually, in terms of, so far as our faith is concerned, it means nothing. It means something from the point of view of the priests, because they're saying that anyone who's a member of the Soka Gakkai or member of SGI is expelled too. So this is an extraordinary and ridiculous happening. How can you expel, something like 20 million people across the world? I'm told that even the petitions that it was proposed we should sign for the resignation of the high priest, they've already reached 14 million. So it's an extraordinary number of people, and a great variety of people at that. So it's really just meaningless. It is a meaningless thing to do, and it has neither any form of religious authority or legal authority. So there is nothing in the head temple regulations to say that he can excommunicate more than one person at a time. And furthermore, they should be able to say something in their defense and have it listened to and considered, none of which has happened, even if you take the Soka Gakkai as a whole. So anyway, we have to look upon this. You can't look at what has happened in the head temple from the aspect of reason, because you will find no reasonable thing in anything that they've done. So I'm sure those priests who wrote letters, albeit anonymously for reasons we can well understand, but what they said is true, that really the devilish force of life, which exists in us all, as we know, has got the upper hand at the moment. And the statements of the high priests and those priests who are in senior positions and who are following him don't make sense. And perhaps we're stupid to even think that they could make sense, because that is the situation. So where should we go from here?
Well, I'd like to actually go to the bit where Nichiren Daishonin talks about the joy of the practice, because it seems that we have to maybe take this more personally now and view it in a new light, and I'd like your opinion on that. It reads, "I cannot hold back my tears when I think of the great persecution confronting me now, or when I think of the joy of attaining Buddhahood in the future. Birds cry, but never shed tears. I, Nichiren, do not cry, but my tears flow ceaselessly. I shed my tears not for worldly affairs, but solely for the sake of the Lotus Sutra. So indeed, they must be tears of Amrita.
Thank you. Yes, it's a good paragraph to read, especially at this time, because, as you say, we can't avoid putting our minds to all this, difficult as it may be to understand, and sometimes even so absurd that we can't believe it's really happening. But we can't just turn a blind eye to it and say we're not concerned. And this, I think, is the importance of the petition, because, as you know, here in the UK, we sent the petition to every member, and I hope even those whose addresses we hadn't got will have received them through their districts and so on. And members have been, wonderful in a way, in the sincerity and concern which they've expressed before they've signed that petition. And happy to say they're flowing in now at a good rate, and I'm so pleased to see that after that thinking and chanting that they've been able to come to the conclusion that they should sign it. And of course, not only on what we've said so far this afternoon in this talk together, but I haven't mentioned the other fact, which was the discovery through a priest who brought his notes on a lecture which had been given in the head temple. And he brought these notes to the Gakkai and gave his verbatim report, which was that the priest Fukuda, who was the priest who came to do Gojukai with us last year, and who we also know at that time was plotting Operation C, anyway, he gave an official lecture at the head temple. It was given to trainee priests, and therefore had the official approval of the head temple authorities. And in this lecture, he stated that the true Buddha for these times is none other than Nichiren Shonin, that Nichiren Daishonin and Nikko Shonin, the second high priest, were provisional Buddhas, that the Gosho were partial provisional teachings, and that the essential teachings for this age were the teachings of Nichiren Shonin. It's unbelievable, but that was what he stated in this lecture. And so one can see from that, of course, and other actions which the high priest has taken, that he is, as one Japanese leader said, he's really hijacked Nichiren Shoshu in order to use it as a vehicle over which he could establish his absolute, infallible authority. Because, as you know, right at the very beginning last January, they altered their temple regulations and included the possibility of excommunication if you even criticized the high priest. So this makes him infallible. So it's incredible. I mean, the Roman Catholic Church, with all its power and strength, had to say finally that the Pope wasn't infallible a long time ago now. I can't remember. I should look up the date, but I haven't. But it's certainly a long time ago. So it's a sort of medieval stance to take in an age, especially in this age, when the movement towards democracy and freedom is so strong. And it really is an age of change, isn't it? So the whole thing, there is no reason. You can't view this in what you would call a reasonable manner.
I have sometimes had difficulty in trying to explain that to my members. I'm a district leader in West London, and I look after 30 people whose practice is very sincere and they're very pure, and they found this immensely upsetting and disorientating. And all I can say to them is what Nichiren Daishonin says at the end of this Gosho, and I'd like to refer you to it and ask for your reassurance that despite all this stuff that's going on at the moment, that as just ordinary people living in London who want to see Kozen Rufu and want to see equality for people, all the time, that this is our guidance to follow and nothing else. It's the last paragraph of this same Gosho, and it reads, "In this letter, I've written my most important teachings. Grasp their meaning and make them part of your life. Believe in the Gohonzon, the supreme object of worship in the world. Forge strong faith and receive the protection of Shakyamuni, Tahoe, and all the other Buddhas. Exert yourself in the two ways of practice and study. Without practice and study, there can be no Buddhism. You must not only persevere yourself, you must also teach others. Both practice and study arise from faith. Teach others to the best of your ability, even if only a single sentence or phrase. Nam Myoho Renge Kyo, Nam Myoho Renge Kyo."